Go ahead.
Okay, everybody, welcome. This is the URPE panel on class. Let's see if I get this name exactly right. Profits, class, and income distribution. I can't see you all, but I want to thank you all for joining us at this session. We have three very diverse papers. The fourth presenter and paper, How Does Globalization Affect Equilibrium and Labor Capital Games, could not join us. So it'll just be the first three papers in the program. And what we'll do is we'll go, here's the format we'll follow. We'll have the presenters go in the order listed on the program. And then we'll have some relatively brief discussant comments. We'll basically be serving as each other's discussants. And I view that exercise as primarily getting the conversation going, because then I hope to turn the webinar to the floor and entertain questions and comments from our listeners, which we welcome. And then we'll have brief time at the end for the presenters to respond to the questions and issues that have been raised. Okay, with that in mind, let's get the program rolling. We'll start with Sean Gu, who will present the empirical relevance of Okishio's theorem. Take it away.
Okay, I'll share my screen. Can you hear my voice? Hello? Can you hear my voice or see my screen?
Yes, I can hear it.
Okay. Is it okay to begin?
Yes, it is. Let me just ask Lauren quickly, how do I enable the chat?
I can turn, they specifically asked us to turn it off. However, I can turn it on, not a problem.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yep, take it away. We can hear you, Sean.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Gu Shan, and I come from China. I'm now a PhD candidate in Tsinghua University, and today I'm very glad to have this opportunity to share our new research with you. The topic of our paper is the empirical relevance of the Okishio theorem, an autoregressive distributed lag approach. My presentation today will cover the following 6 parts. The first part is an introduction of our research, which focuses on the Okishio theorem proposed in 1961 by a famous Japanese economist. The Okishio theorem states that as long as the real wage rate is fixed, any technical change that satisfies the cost criterion will increase the long-run equilibrium rate of profit. However, this assertion seems contrary to Marxist law of falling profit rate, which claims that when the rate of surplus value is constant, the increasing organic composition of capital tends to decrease the general rate of profit. Now we know that the theoretical robustness of Okishio theorem has been proved by many scholars. However, there is still a very important question we want to ask. Is the Okishio theorem really contrary to Marxist law? And our answer is no. In fact, in the third volume of Capital, Marx did mention about the counteracting factors which will offset the decreasing trend of profit, such as the improvement of labor productivity and the increasing rate of surplus value. And after some investigation, we can also find that due to these factors, the profit rate will still rise, even when we add the assumption of increasing organic composition of capital into the Okishio theorem. So the main difference between the two theorems is that for Marx, the effects of counteracting factors may be limited. However, Okishio theorem shows that these effects may exceed the influence of increasing organic composition of capital. In fact, there are many scholars who claim that the limitation of counteracting factors cannot be proved strictly. And they also think that the organic composition of capital is not necessarily inversely proportional to profit rate due to when the real wage is fixed. So in a word, the alteration of profit rate due to the increasing organic composition of capital is in fact uncertain, which left it to be an empirical question for us. So this is the starting point of our research, that is to implement an empirical study of the relationship of the two. And to answer this question, is the Okishio theorem supported by real-world data? The next part is some literature review of the Okishio theorem. Firstly, we proposed a simple restatement of the Okishio theorem. Here, the profit rate is determined by this equilibrium price system in equation 1. And the cost criterion is expressed by equation 2. Here, the prime indicates the new production technique. After the adoption of new technique and the adjustment of prices, the new equilibrium now changes to equation 3. And what Okishio theorem wants to prove is that R prime is greater than R. And this is the main statement of Okishio theorem. The theoretical robustness of Okishio theorem has been proved by many scholars. It is proved that this theorem can be expanded properly into many situations under certain conditions. For example, the fixed capital and joint production, and the cases like product innovation. Meanwhile, the criticism of historical cost accounting is not strong enough to deny the correctness of Okishio theorem. However, there are few empirical researches about Okishio theorem. The following four available literatures, they are all descriptive in nature, and they might not have reviewed the true causal link of the technical change and the profit rate. So this is the blank that our research wants to fill. The next part is about the measurement of our variables and the sources of our data. Here we have three main variables: the rate of profit, the organic composition of capital, and the real wage rate. The rate of profit is measured in two methods. The first one is the ratio between profits and the net worth. The reason to use the net worth as our denominator is that we think the returns on capital advance is what the for-profit capitalist cares most. However, as a robustness check, we also calculated this RF using non-residential fixed assets as the denominator instead of net worth. The organic composition of capital is calculated by equation 5, following Sheikh's interpretation of capital deepening. Here, we also use the real depreciation in place of fixed assets as another robustness check. As for the data, we use the time series of the US aggregate non-financial corporate economy data for the period of 1947 to 2018. And most original data are all from the official sources. Here, this figure reports the time series of our three main variables. And we can see in the last graph, we can see a clear upward trend of the organic composition of capital. In the first part, we built an econometric model and proposed our main hypothesis. Here, we adopted an Ardl model for the consideration that there might be some short-run adjustment due to the adoption of new production techniques. In this model, R represents profit rate, and C represents the organic composition of capital, and W represents the real wage rate. Here, Z is our control variables, including accumulation rate of capital, centralization of capital, wage pressure, and the terms of trade. And our core parameter is phi j, which indicates the elasticities of R with respect to C. One important advantage of this model is that it allows us to differentiate the effects of increasing C among short, interim, and long period. So we then did some calculations about these different effects. Here, the contemporaneous effect of C on R is directly represented by the phi 0. And the interim effect is calculated by equation 7. Here, rho represents the partial effect, which means the change rate of R in period T plus J due to 1 unit permanent increase in CT. That's indicated by equation 8. And the long run effect is calculated by equation 9. Since Okishio theorem cares about the profit rate in the new equilibrium after all adjustment, so we think that the long run effect is our foremost concern. Here we propose our main hypothesis that lambda is greater than 0. The next part is the econometric procedure and some of our results. Here, our first step is to implement a unit root test and to do some treatment to make sure that all the variables we finally use are stationary. The second step is to select a proper model. By adopting the from general to specific method, as well as other residual tests, we finally choose 3 alternative models. And the models and the regression results are exhibited in table 3. Here, model 1 is our main model with R on C. And model 2 replaces C with D, which measures the organic composition of capital with depreciation. And model 3 replaces R with RF, where the profit rate is measured with fixed assets rather than net worth. With the well-specified models, we then go on to analyze the impact, the interim and the long-run effect of organic composition of capital on profit rate. And here it is clear that at time 0, where the new technique is adopted, the impact effect is negative due to a possible immediate and higher adjustment cost. However, after 2 years, the interim effect all turned positive, as the table shows. The long-run effect of the 3 model is 1.75, 0.77, and 1.39 respectively, and they are all greater than 0. In the next step, we use the bootstrap method to test our main hypothesis. And we can draw the conclusion that the long-run effect of organic composition of capital on the rate of profit is significantly positive. In the end, We also performed a gradual causality test in a VAR framework, and this makes sure that the causality actually runs from organic composition of capital to the profit rate, not the other way around. And these are the main works of our research. To conclude, our research shows that the Okishio theorem is supported by the empirical evidence to some extent, which means that in the real economy, it does exist for a certain period, that the counteracting effects may be the leading factors in the variation of profit rates. However, in my opinion, this doesn't mean that the counteracting effects can always exceed the influence of rising organic composition of capital. So this leaves us with the remaining questions. The first one is, how is the Okishio theorem related to Marxist law? My answer to this question is that the Okishio theorem is in fact a possible case included in the Marx theory. However, this answer still can't help us to fully understand the law of falling profit rate. So what is the right way of thinking Marxist law? In my opinion, maybe the most important thing is not whether the profit rate is rising or decreasing, but how these driving factors interact with each other and how they finally lead to the phenomena such as economic cycles and crises. And this is also the standpoint of Harvey, which we think may provide us with good guidance in our further studies. And that's all of my presentation. The following are references of our paper. Thank you for listening, and we really look forward to hear your comments and advice. Should I stop sharing or keep on?
Nope. Let's see. Yeah, stop sharing for the moment. I'll ask you to put your paper back up when we get to the discussion session, especially for audience questions. Let me ask the audience now that if they have any clarification questions, to please post a question. Oh yeah, it's Gu. The question was, is your paper available? So do you have, can you indicate where it's available?
I think maybe I should ask.
Yes.
Oh, yes. Yes. Okay.
It is
yes.
posted.
It's posted. Okay.
Yeah.
Answer to that is yes. Thank you. Okay. The next paper on our program is mine. So I will hit the share screen function and hopefully get, there we go. All right. Well, now for a complete change of pace, as is typical for URPE sessions at ASSA, we have 3 very diverse papers. So where we saw an excellent econometric presentation with the previous paper, mine is a purely theoretical exercise. My title is somewhat different than that listed in the program. What is a working day? Determination of labor hours in a Marxian model of capitalist production is the current working title. Here is the a paradox I'd like to motivate the discussion with. The paradox concerns the contrast between Marx's depiction of capitalist production in the first volume of Capital and formal models of capitalist production in a Marxian framework or perspective. On the one hand, Marx makes the following characterization claims about the nature of capitalist production. First, Marx says that capitalist production proper, the capitalist mode of production, is characterized by direct capitalist control of the production process, for which he coins the term subsumption of labor under capital. This has two stages. At the start of the capitalist mode of production, you have formal subsumption, which Marx defines as a situation where capitalists take over existing labor processes without changing the technique of production and just instituting direct supervisory oversight. Then later it's followed by what he calls real subsumption of labor under capital, where they also change the technique of production. But the focus here is on that universal aspect of capitalist control, which he calls the formal subsumption of labor under capital. Second, the key implication Marx associates with formal subsumption is the creation of absolute surplus value, which he understands as surplus value that results from lengthening the working day. Those familiar with Capital Volume 1 will in fact recognize his argument that capitalists have a raging thirst for surplus labor that forces them to push the working day as long as possible. And then third, somewhat less obviously, Marx argues that an implication of the operation of formal subsumption and the corresponding creation of absolute surplus value is an increase in the scale of production. Capitalists want to expand the scale of output, even keeping the current technique of production. So this has nothing to do with itself with changing the technology. Now contrast that with the way that formal models of capitalist production in the Marxian vein, as well as what I would call the neo-Ricardian vein, have typically characterized production. Here I'm referring to, when I speak of the Marxian formal literature, my examples are, for instance, Marishima, Romer, and in the neo-Ricardian vein, Passanetti, Kurtz and Salvadori, and others. And formally, this should be recognizable to everybody who's invested in this literature. You have these linear input-output models that specify a matrix A of physical input requirements and a vector L of labor inputs, typically represented in terms of, let's say, labor time, but could also be units of labor power as they are in Gu's paper. And then specifying a wage rate, W. The striking thing about this representation is constant returns to scale is assumed, implying that capitalists have no particular interest in increasing the scale of production. They're indifferent to that. And then the point I want to especially focus on for my presentation, there's no distinction in talking about labor time L between the number of workers providing labor hours and hours per worker, H, right? So if we imagine that in the typical model, L is equal to number of workers N times hours per worker H, no specification is made about capitalist preference for one for the other. When you combine the assumption of a fixed hourly wage rate with the assumption that there's a constant substitution between number of workers N and hours H in the production of labor, total labor hours L, you get the capitalist firms are in effect totally indifferent to the allocation of labor time between number of workers and hours per worker, which once again is directly contrary to the key things that Marx is insisting are central to capitalist production. So it's striking that there's this fundamental difference or dichotomy between the formal representation and what Marx argues is characteristic of capitalist production in the first volume of Capital. I want to emphasize that this is not a wholesale indictment of this formal model. As I point out in the paper, the formal model supports a lot of powerful results. We've already seen that example in Gu's paper. But I'm curious to know, what are the implications of this particular dichotomy? Therefore, what I do in this paper is I introduce elements that would affect capitalist firms' trade-off between number of workers and hours per worker, so that it isn't a matter of indifference. And then I consider the economic implications of capitalist profit maximizing choice of number of workers hired versus how hard they work or how long they work in a given day, and see what the economic consequences are for the standard formal model. I do this with in the simplest possible case, so it's a one sector model. As I'll discuss later, the obvious extension would be to extend to the multi-sector case. The two key innovations that I introduce is that there's a variable elasticity of substitution in production between number of workers and hours per worker. And second, I introduce the possibility of nonlinear worker compensation, which basically just means possible departures from a straight hourly wage as the representation of labor cost. And I'll skate over the implications because I'll mostly talk about them in the body of the paper, just to make sure I'm not going over time. The key point is that each of these changes from the standard model creates significant effects. First, if all you did was change the individual labor cost function, so diverge from just hourly wages, capitalists care about the number of hours worked. And in particular, if you have an affine payment scheme or labor cost scheme, what that means basically is a fixed component plus an hourly wage, then capitalists want the maximum possible working day. If you have variable elasticity of substitution in production between hours and numbers of workers, then capitalists care specifically about how many hours are worked, but you maintain the assumption of constant returns to scale. Third, the thing I'm going to focus on in my paper is that when you combine the two variations from the standard model, you get the dramatic result that you can have declining average cost, so that capitalists want to always increase the scale of output until workers are always working at the maximum labor time. And finally, as we'll see when I get to the end of my presentation, the fourth bullet there, I'm going to talk about possible externalities of profit maximizing choices of hours by capitalists. So that's the broad overview. The analytical framework, I'm not going to go into great analytical detail, so I'll just give you the highlights. The paper is available. So I'm using a simple one sector model. It is linear, just as in the standard model, so that at the level of non-physical inputs A, or physical inputs A, and labor inputs L in the aggregate, you have constant returns to scale, fixed coefficients, right? So this looks just like the standard model. However, effective labor time is given by now a function that is continuously differentiable twice, second degree homogeneous, so basically increasing returns, so that when you double the number of hours and double the number of workers, you get 4 times the amount of labor, total labor hours. Strictly quasi-concave, which just means you get nice convex isoquants for labor time. And you have variable elasticity of substitution. So the example that I use throughout the paper, although the formal results don't depend on the example, is the one given at bottom. The key thing I would have you note about that production function at the bottom is that if the parameter rho is 0, you get the standard representation that total labor hours is number of workers times hours per worker. When rho is not 0, however, you get the possibility that you can't just combine number of workers and hours per worker to get effective labor hours. The only time where you do is when there's an exact proportion, alpha, between the number of workers and the hours worked per worker. Alpha represents, if you'd like, the hours intensity of the production of labor time, the extent to which you would favor hours per worker over number of workers in producing a given number of labor hours. I should talk a little bit about the intuition behind that. The intuition there is labor hours per worker and number of workers are not perfect substitutes. If, for instance, you need a certain minimum number of workers, for instance, to carry pianos out of an apartment or something, if that's the labor process, and you might need a certain minimum number of hours per worker to avoid wasteful changeover time between workers and shifts. Here's a really crude drawing of what the implication of this production process is. You have the curved line is an isoquant for the production of total labor hours, L. Notice that it goes vertical up in the upper portion and goes horizontal in the lower portion. That's the consequence of declining substitutability of hours and number of workers. Unlike in the standard L equals N times H, where you always have a downward slope. The line going through the middle, alpha N equals H, is the line where you of maximum productivity. That is, if you use workers in that proportion, you have the lowest possible required combination of N and H to get the needed total amount of hours, L. I spoke of a wage norm in the paper. I generalized that notion to the notion of an individual labor cost function. This basically combines the payment scheme, the way that the capitalist actually pays the worker, with any possible non-wage costs. For instance, Mike, who I know, Mirapal, who's attending the session, points out benefit packages to workers would vary with the number of workers, but not with the number of hours. And therefore, it would be in the fixed component of what I'm calling the individual labor cost function. Finally, I capture another key aspect of Marx's model or discussion in Capital One that is typically not emphasized, which is that the harder workers work, the more subsistence wage they need. So subsistence wages are increasing in number of hours worked in this story. And that's the small omega function. So the capital omega function is individual labor cost. The small omega function is subsistence cost. A key point in the paper is there's no necessary connection between the subsistence function and the individual labor cost function. That depends on the balance of class power. Workers, for instance, might be driven below subsistence wages, depending on the power of capitalists to regulate wages. Therefore, basically, what the analysis of the paper centers on is the notion of cost minimization. So what this line says is that each capitalist will minimize labor cost defined as the individual labor cost, the cost per worker, capital omega, times the number of workers, such that the production function for effective hours, F, is satisfied, and workers produce less than labor hours less than or equal to the maximum dictated either by biology, you need a certain amount of sleep, social conditions, people need some degree of recreation with others, or legal conditions, such as caps on the legal working day. Analysis of this problem leads to the labor cost function, C of L, which provides the basis for my formal results. What are the implications of capitalist cost minimization with these variations? First, hours are increasing in output, assuming now that you have a unique solution. So one key point that I'll get to a little bit later is that you may not have a unique solution in the standard model. But if there's a unique solution, optimal hours are increasing in output if and only if you have imperfect substitutability of hours and number of workers. Here's the key point that I want to emphasize, is the second point of the proposition, which is you get linear cost, that is, you get constant returns to scale, only under very special conditions that are associated with the standard model. Generally, once you depart from the conditions of the standard model, so you have other than fixed hourly wage rate and perfect substitutability, if you depart from that, the labor cost function, and therefore the production cost function, no longer exhibits constant returns to scale. That's the most dramatic single inference, I think, of the basic cost analysis. Then just an insight from profit maximization. Suppose you have a declining average cost. Then capitalists will always want workers to choose maximal hours. So, in brief, the basic point of the analysis is that once you depart from the assumptions of the standard model, hours worked per worker become critical. And in fact, you can get under an identifiable set of conditions. The result of cost minimization and profit maximization is capitalists drive workers to the maximum possible hours, which, just to contextualize this, Marx associates with an unsustainable outcome in which labor power is degraded over time. Briefly, let me illustrate the implications of this analysis with 4 scenarios. First, the standard scenario, as I mentioned, capitalists are indifferent between number of workers and hours per worker, and workers are paid a straight wage rate, and that's all that labor costs involve. In that case, there's an infinity of tangency points between the iso cost curve and the isoquant, meaning capitalists are completely indifferent between number of workers and hours per worker. There's also constant returns to scale, just as the standard model predicts. Now, Marx's scenario in Capital One is that, in effect, wages paid to worker per day are fixed. Surprisingly, perhaps, this was in fact standard in Marx's day, that workers were paid, industrial workers were paid by the day rather than by the hour, if in fact, maybe even weekly. So in effect, the daily wage rate is fixed. In that case, in this model, capitalists always choose maximum possible hours, just as Marx insists in Chapter 10 on the working day in Volume 1. Third scenario is when you augment this model to include an hourly wage rate, but still a fixed component. That, for instance, could be a benefits package, or it could simply be quasi-fixed labor costs, costs that vary with the number of workers, like, for instance, the need to provide startup training. In that case, capitalists will again want to choose the maximum number of hours. Let me make sure, 18, 12. Okay, I should be wrapping up soon. And then finally, if you have a convex cost function, then you get a standard neoclassical U-shaped average cost curve rather than a horizontal average cost curve as in the standard model. I will just briefly mention the last part of the paper that talks about the externalities of capitalist hours choices. The first effect I call the disemployment effect, that when capitalists choose the length of the working day, they ignore the effect on the economic surplus of disemploying workers who nevertheless have to receive a subsistence wage in order to stay alive. In other words, there's a cost to maintaining the industrial reserve army that capitalists ignore when they choose labor hours. Second, the effect that is the one that Marx emphasizes, but I don't get into much in the paper, is that if the individual labor cost function does not reflect subsistence, that is, if capitalists are able to pay workers less than subsistent wage, then because of the excessive hours demands on workers, labor power is degraded over time, leading to the interesting implication that you could actually benefit capitalists as well as workers by limiting the working day, which Marx in fact says in Capital One. Why don't I conclude there in the interest of time and move to our get rid of this on the screen. How do I do that? Hold on. Yeah, good. And now turn over the floor to Sue. Is that right? Who will be presenting the third paper? So this paper is hypothetically decoupling the Chinese economy from the US economy.
She's unmuted. She's muted, I guess. What's happening?
Let's see. I can hear you. So
yeah.
Okay.
Is she gone?
Are we waiting? Ah, I see. So interesting. You're both listed under the same name in your little tags.
Me?
Who's presenting the third paper?
Sue.
Sue is. Okay.
So I should leave?
No, you shouldn't leave, but Lauren, could you unmute Sue, the other Sue?
Me.
The problem is you're both listed under the same name. You might want to change your tag. Yeah, there you go. There you go. And could you unmute her? There we go. There we go. Thank you. Thanks, Lauren. Okay, so now we can hear you. Good news. There we go. Excellent.
Let me see my Hello, everyone. My name is Li Jun Su, and I'm a research assistant from Nankai University. And the subject of my presentation is China's new dual circulation development strategy in the face of reverse globalization. And we explained why China makes such a strategic turn. Trade protectionism never disappears. It can be as strong as able to cause a wave of reverse globalization. The US and China trade war started by the Trump administration is our most recent memory. The Phase 1 trade deal signed in January 2020 represents the most recent ceasefire between the two countries. Most details in the text about the how China should live up to these commitments. The significant leverage the US has over China in such a trade war scenario profoundly reveals China's vulnerability being the workshop of the world. Under these circumstances, China has come up with a new foreign economic strategy at this special historical conjuncture that is dubbed as a dual circulation strategy. And the new strategy seem to counterpose and mark the end of the so-called Great International Economic Circulation Strategy that underpins China's economic rise in the past 4 decades. The question is why China is making such a strategic turn. We argue that the new strategy is a response to the current external risks as well as an acceleration of China's long-term adjustment to a more balanced economy. To facilitate the understanding of this economic strategic turn, we first provide a brief account of China's development in recent decades in the context of globalization. And then we carry out an input-output analysis that gauges the risk of reverse globalization that is facing China. We think that we can understand China's development from the perspective of capital accumulation within the context of globalization. The main point of our research, we think that the economic globalization process has a dual nature. It means that on the one hand, it globalizes and promotes the social forces of production and helps to restore the rate of profits in developed world, and it brings growth to and development to the developing world. On the other hand, the fundamental contradiction of capitalism, one between private ownership of the means of production and socialized production, express itself globalized capital backed by the state and traumatized working class, and the contradiction between the global hegemon and its challenger. We believe that this dual nature implies that international economic conflicts and trade protectionism are inherent concomitants of economic globalization. We think that China seizes such an opportunity at a critical turning point of its economic development. After Deng took power in 1976, he steered the country into the direction of market economy with the opening up policy aiming to integrate China with the world economy. And the Chinese government then proposed a great international sufficient development strategy to increase China's foreign currency reserves and introduce advanced technology from the West by developing processing trade and introducing foreign direct investment. Since then, China has developed into a typical export-led economy that heavily relies on processing trade, with both its imports, exports, current account, trade surplus, and foreign reserves rocketing. We can see in Figure 1 that this the fact that China development used to be. So, however, the developing country like China that has an ambition to catch up with the West is never considered as a safe player in the global division of labor because of we are think not as a market economy and something else, when the rise of China has become so notable that it begins to compete with the West for the most advanced technologies. Western states, especially the US, be that the Democratic or Republican Party in office, unanimously consider China as a threat to their national interest. So when confronted with China's economic rivalry, it is a combination of the right-wing nationalist sentiment and the urge to contain China's global economic power that led the Trump administration to start a trade war with China. China also has its own problems that is due to the globalization progress. The internal contradictions within China are no less acute. After 4 decades into its opening up, the issues of environmental degradations, urban-rural inequality, and uneven regional development in China has become so severe that many criticize the Chinese model of development despite its seemingly success. Chinese scholar Jia coins the concept of the great domestic circulation strategy as opposed to the dominant great international circulation strategy and urges China to sever its close tie with processing trade to deal with the many internal problems we talked about. The Chinese government also announces as early as 2005, before the 2008, that it will gradually expand its domestic demand to have a more balanced economy, together with an aim to upgrade its industrial structure. The external demand shock due to the 2008 global financial crisis also pushes China to focus more on its domestic demand. However, this upgrading process has been slow. Then here comes the Trump administration. We believe that it is the hostile Trump administration that propels China to seriously take note of the new external risk, decoupling, which was once proclaimed by Trump. So we wonder how large the risk of decoupling is and whether the potential consequences are large enough to support such a quantitative interpretation of China's strategic shift as outlined above. In what follows, we provide a comment of these questions. This is our model and data. We base our quantitative analysis on the global extraction method that hypothetically reshuffle the supply and demand relations in a global input-output framework to study the associated counterfactor effect. And we use a word input-output database, which we usually use. And to bridge the gap between the original data and unmarked categories, we follow shake and tonic in treating the issues of depreciation and productive and unproductive activities. We take care of the issues of heterogeneous labor by using the human capital index from the Pan World data also. With the setup and data as described in the last session, we first provide a description of the positions of China and the US in the global production network and global distribution. This table presents the decomposition of gross output along two dimensions that can roughly capture countries' economic structure. The top three exporting industries and the economic totals are selected for presentation. We can see that on the supply side, the Chinese economy heavily relies on imports that consist of 64.2% of the gross output at the aggregate level. And the Chinese export heavily rely on the US market. In contrast, the US imports heavily rely on Chinese supply, while its exports are mainly sold to its neighbors, Canada and Mexico. This asymmetric reliance gives us the US an upper hand when it comes to the trade war where exports are targeted. We then calculate the transfer of labor value based on the labor serial value as a proxy for distributional positions. This table reports the value transfer to countries. It reveals the US is a heavy exploiter country, while China is exploited. Although the labor value transferred out of China has been decreasing since 2010, the magnitude is still huge and comparable to the labor that is transferred into the US, with the former being 69.8% of the latter in 2014. One may argue that China's transferred labor is reflected in the form of trade surplus in its current account and saved as its dollar reserves that gives China the necessary
We pause due to technical difficulties. Now we'll shift to the discussion portion of our session. And the way we'll proceed is we'll start with some relatively brief discussion remarks from the presenters, who will also be acting as discussants for each other's paper. We're not experts in our respective fields, so these won't be detailed. However, we do hope to get some feedback and from our audience, and we do invite your participation. We thank you for sticking with us. Oh, look at that. Li Jun, are you back?
Everybody hear me?
Okay,
Yeah.
go ahead and finish. That's good news. Great.
Okay. This is our main finding. This table presents the potential consequences of a complete decoupling of the US and China merchandise trade. If both parties were to transfer their trade with the other party, to elsewhere proportionally, China would see, let's say, 2.47 percentage point slowdown in its growth rate, which translates into 11.6 million job losses, a stunning magnitude that it is enough to destabilize the Chinese society. This pain would be intensely felt in the labor-intensive sector. As for the US, it would gain 1.32 percentage point in its overall growth with 676,000 more jobs created, though some sectors will suffer from slowdown and job losses. We also found that even if China internalized its demand for the US goods as opposed to trade transfer, it will not help mitigate the negative impact. It is even a bit worse. So here comes our conclusion. That is why China make this strategic turn. It is because the uneven development and the increasing risk of reverse globalization, it is a logical step for China to focus on more its domestic production network while maintaining its free access to the global economy. So that's our main findings of our research. That's all. Thank you for listening. Sorry about the internet problems.
No problem. Sheshe. Yep. So this is excellent. Thank you to the other presenters for these excellent presentations. As I had just mentioned previously, we'll now switch to the discussion portion, and we'll have brief comments from each of the panelists following again the order of the presentations. And then we will turn to the audience and invite your questions. I see, and I note to my fellow panelists, there are already some questions in the Q&A portion icon at the bottom that you are welcome to either answer live or write written answers to. In addition, we have enabled the chat, so you can also ask questions via chat when we get to that segment. Okay, I'll kick things off since the Okishio paper, Gu Shan's paper was first. I'll make some initial comments on that. I have one question about the Chinese circulation strategy paper, but I'll save those for after Gu's comments and questions on their paper, so I don't overlap with her. So some brief comments then on the paper, on the Okishio theorem paper, the empirical test. I want to start off with 2 points of appreciation. First, this paper makes an important contribution. As it notes, there is no real econometric test out there of this result, Okishio theorem, that is a central result in modern Marxian economics. There are some descriptive, kind of evaluative contributions that looks at some data, but there's no real causal test or econometric test. So as a result, this paper promises to make a very significant addition to this literature. And I was very pleased to read the paper as a result, even if not very much up on the econometric technique. The second appreciation is specific to the paper itself. One of my standards for how my evaluation of a paper is the extent to which it anticipates questions that I have as I read the paper. And it was quite striking that this paper's discussion anticipated some of the obvious questions I might have asked as a discussant and already addressed them, which is impressive to the co-authors. Bravo. Makes my job as discussant harder because more of what I have to say is superfluous. But it does show the command that the authors have of their subject matter and of its application to the literature, which I commend them for. So that being said, here are my comments and questions. The first point, of course, the authors have already anticipated. To what extent, which is a broad question of theoretical connection, to what extent is Okishio's theorem, as stated, really, to use the paper's words, in stark contrast to Marx's theory? And I would say it is not at all evident that it is. Basically, the starting point for Marx's so-called law of the tangentially falling rate of profit is the notion that if you held the rate of surplus value or the rate of exploitation constant, then when you increase the organic composition of capital, that the profit rate must fall. The rate of exploitation is essentially a story about wage share rather than wage rate. As the authors correctly note, Marx also says, hey, even if the wage share were to increase a little bit, if the rate of exploitation were to increase a little bit, my theorem would still hold, or my result would still hold. I take that just to be a continuity result, that if the theorem definitely holds for a fixed wage share, for a very slight increase in the wage share, it might still hold. But in any case, the relevant test, if you took Marx literally, would be holding the wage share constant. Is it true that the rate of profit falls or does not? Now, there is, of course, a critique of this line of reasoning from the competitive standpoint. Romer, in particular, has made this point, that in a competitive economy, the relevant ceteris paribus assumption is wage rate rather than wage share, because there's nothing in a competitive framework that would guarantee maintenance of a given wage share. There is, however, a literature out there that talks about alternative models of wage formation based on, for instance, bargaining power, that would deliver an equilibrium constant wage share in response to a technological change. So that is kind of like away from the main point of the paper, because they're specifically focusing on Okishio's theorem. But it does speak to the relevance, potential relevance to Marx's actual theory. My second comment is my main point, which is, to what extent is this really a demonstration of the relevance of Okishio's theorem? What do I mean? As the authors, again, correctly point out, the paper doesn't, the issue here is actually the empirical one of what in fact do capitalists do when they choose technical innovations to the production process, right? Do they in fact choose to minimize cost or to reduce cost at going prices, which other thing, ceteris paribus implies that the profit rate would increase, or did they choose to do something else? As the authors correctly note, they don't actually test that. They don't go out and gather data and test, is this how capitalists choose their technical innovations, right? All they say is, well, on the assumption that capitalists actually choose to cost minimize, do the data we see in the real world, are they consistent with that behavioral assumption that is the basis for the Okishio theorem, rather than the contrary behavioral hypothesis that is the basis for critiques such as that by Shake, right? The one warning I would make is kind of the obvious one, that since the Okishio theorem is not an if and only if theorem, it's just a sufficient condition theorem, it's not clear that you've showed consistency of the real world with the Okishio theorem result, but not verification that the specific mechanism assumed by Okishio, that is cost minimizing innovation choices, is specifically verified. There might be other behavioral responses that also yield a correlation between rising profits and given wage rate, right? Technical innovations, rising organic composition of capital, given the constant wage rate, raises the range of profits. So it's consistent with the Okishio result, but it doesn't really confirm the Okishio result per se. Here is my operational question to the co-authors. Surely counter hypotheses like shakes has empirical implications in much the same way that cost minimizing behavior in my paper has empirical implications that could be studied directly, even if the technical innovation strategy per se is not able to be studied directly. So my question to the co-authors is there a way that you could directly challenge the shake critique by deriving implications for equilibrium behavior of his counter hypothesis? I mean implications other than the impact on the profit rate. And then gather data to test those things. The third major comment is kind of a footnote, frankly. And the authors, again, have anticipated this. It strikes me that by Marx's definition of constant capital, you would obviously want to use your fallback procedure of depreciation rate to capture the measure of constant capital rather than your fixed asset measure. Now, it may well be there's no significant difference, and I would just like the authors to speak to what difference, if any, did using the two different measures make? That is my theoretical presumption that using the depreciation rate is more appropriate at all borne out by the data and by your empirical tests? I'll save the question I have for the China's double circulation paper till later and turn the floor over to Gu.
Should I do some comment on Li Jun's paper? Okay. I think this paper is really very valuable research, and since the dual circulation is now a very important policy in China, and it acts like a direction of Chinese economy development since this year and maybe in the later 5 years. And this paper provides us with explanation of why we need these dual circulation policies. And I think this is a very valuable start point. And I'm not sure I understand the paper very good. So here I just want to ask one question, and maybe the author can answer me. And my question is, I'm not sure I understand your mechanism of decoupling behavior. So I want to know how do you measure the decoupling behavior in your model, since I think maybe I missed the important information during your presentation. And that's all.
Okay, good. Actually, that's a great segue for me. Before we, Junxiang, you'll be giving comments on my paper, right? Before we go to that, let me just append a question to the authors on the China double circulation paper. It has to do with the, what should I call it? The graduability of the global extraction method that you use. Your counterfactual hypothesis is complete decoupling. Does your method allow enough finesse or nuance that you can do various degrees of partial decoupling and assess those effects? And would it make any difference? That is, does your method enable you to pick up non-linearities in the effect? So that if, for instance, there's declining marginal impact on the economy of partial decoupling, would your global extraction method be able to pick that up? Right. So that's the question I had after I read through your paper. So with that, let me turn it over to Jun Xiang for comments on my paper before we turn to the audience.
Thank you. So I have a couple of comments, some general, some very specific. I guess I should just spell out the general comments here and then send it to you after this meeting.
Thank you.
Yes. So I will come on the general argument and the general setting, since I quickly get lost in the notations and the many formal assumptions involved. I think the paper can reach wider readership if they can be further simplified with more intuitive explanations of each formal assumption. And I want to start with an appreciation of the paper. I think it is very interesting and important to study the mechanism determining how many how many hours people are working each day. I think this has extreme relevance for some industries like finance industry, where people are known to work very long hours, and also the high-tech industries, especially relevant for, the current Chinese society, where people have seen themselves working more and more hours over the past few decades, every day, and although their real income is rising, and I think this phenomenon is so widely felt. Even my father complained once to me, who is not an economist, he just complained. He said, during the Maoist era, the official goal of development is for people to work like 5 hours a day. But now, why are we working so many hours a day, like 12, 13? And are we going backward? Although, this is a contradiction here, right? We are seeing our income rising, but not necessarily the welfare in terms of leisure. And this phenomenon also last year triggers a very notable and well-organized protest among the high-tech industries, the so-called anti-996 movement. 996 means a working schedule that starts at 9 a.m. and at 9 p.m. and 6 days a week. That's very typical in the Chinese high-tech industry. And then people just protest because it's because last year some top cabinets in China even proposed to generalize this schedule to every aspect of their company, and they even want to extend this work schedule. So I think it's very important to look at this aspect and explain why even in today's conditions, capitalists want people to work so long every day. And I think your paper can perfectly do this job, explain this. So that's the appreciation I have for the paper. And then in the following, I'm going to make some comments. The first one is the claim that the conventional linear input-output model is at odds with Marx's theory of the absolute surplus value. I think it does not seem very convincing to me. The reason is that Marx is dealing with a daily wage payment system, which is pervasive at that time, while the IO, the conventional IO method treats an hourly wage system, which I think is also relevant. So when talking about the extraction of absolute surplus value, must always assume a given wage, a given daily wage, as you have mentioned in your presentation, regardless how many hours workers work every day. So I believe if I understand him correctly, the class struggle in capital is about how many hours workers should work for a given daily wage. Given this understanding, I would frame the contribution of this paper as a generalization of the IO framework, rather than a critique of it. I mean, they are just dealing with different aspects of the problem. And I think this generalization is very relevant for today's salary workers who are paid monthly given amount, since the salary is predetermined, and the payment for the overtime work might subject to a lot of power dynamics. And then the next comment is actually a question. So somewhere you write the unit labor requirement, the small l, increases in the long run when the workers are paid less than their subsistence wage, which you see as the implication of Marx's comment. I do not understand why the small l would be affected by the wage, since it is given a technical requirement. So it is effective labor required to produce 1 unit of output, right? So I take that as so part of the production technique. But somewhere, in the paper, you seem to allow the small l to change, which would imply a technical change. I'm not sure if the paper has sufficiently deal with the issue of technical change. And I think the other points are just minor. I can just send it to you after the meeting. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
All right, thank you for these excellent comments. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn the floor over to our audience. Thank you so much for staying with us. I would like the panelists to note that there are some written questions already down in the Q&A icon, which you can choose to answer either in writing or orally. And I leave that up to you. So what I'm going to do now is ask the audience if they would like to contribute new questions via chat, which is now enabled, and or issue questions in the Q&A section. So I'll give people a couple of minutes to pose questions. And then basically what I'll do is, in the order of the presentations, I'll ask the presenters to respond to either the Q&A questions or the chat questions, as well as to the issues raised by the discussants. And that'll be basically the last, well, depending on how many questions everybody has, that'll be the last portion of our session, the last 20 minutes, let's say. So let's see here. Let's go ahead. And I'm not seeing a flood of chat questions, to say the least. So let's do this. We have these questions in the Q&A session. So why don't we proceed in order to answer them? So there's a question from Mike Mirapol on the China double circulation paper. Would you all like to address that?
Maybe we should let the presenter begin, and then I can complement.
Okay, Sue, would you like to offer comments or a response to the question? You're muted. You're muted, yeah. Oh, Lauren, can you unmute Sue?
Oh,
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Unmute.
There we go. Great.
I'm good.
There you go.
Oh, okay. Yes. I'll first respond to the question raised by Gushan. We actually how we measure the decoupling. We suppose countries and country like the China and the US completely halt their merchandise trade, both transferring away their demand for the other party's goods proportionally to their other suppliers. In this case, we suppose countries stop buying from China or the US. And to answer the question, Professor Skillman asked, the paper we posted on the website is our short version of our paper. In the long version of our paper, we raised the partial decoupling of the US and China trade in our long version of paper. But we think that the partial decoupling and the complete decoupling is only it's a proportional it's in proportion to each other. So we think it does not have some impact on the conclusion. So we choose the complete decoupling.
Yep.
In this case, in our short version of our paper. That's why we.
Could I ask a question about that? Is that because
yeah.
there are no non-linearities in the effects of partial decoupling, or just that the global extraction method doesn't really give you much scope for picking up such non-linearities?
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. All right.
Mm.
So I think what we'll do now is go in the order of the presentations and have each presenter respond to the discussants and or the question and answer questions. And that, of course, if we finish early, that will give our participants, our audience, a chance to ask additional questions if they think of them. So with that, I turn it to Gu.
Okay, I will answer Professor Skillman's questions first, but I'm not sure I remember all of your questions. So I will start with the last question. It seems you want to ask about why do we use the depreciation instead of the fixed assets?
Vice versa. Why do you use fixed assets rather than depreciation?
Oh, okay. Because as I remember, it seems like fixed assets is a very common use measurement of the capital K, and the fixed assets are quite different from the depreciation things. I'm not sure I can answer this question. Maybe I'll ask Jingshang for help.
Yeah, let me jump in here. So the reason to use the fixed asset as the numerator is to accord with Marx emphasize on the role of fixed capital. And he thinks that represent the change in the fixed capital represent the increasing organic composition of capital better than using the raw materials or depreciation, because he see the roles of big machines are very important in driving the development of capitalism. And that's the main reason. And why do we alternatively use depreciation? That's to have a flow consistency, because the fixed asset is a stock variable.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah,
Sorry.
labor hours is the flow. I mean,
Yep.
that is still meaningful because you can measure how many machines each worker is working with at the point of time, right?
Right.
But to have a stock consistency, we use the depreciation, which will measure how many materials or machines that would be consumed by, that will be used by each worker in the production process.
That's right.
Yeah, that's the purpose of having these two alternative measures.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm agreeing with that. And I'm saying that it seems to me the more appropriate measure, given Marx's definition of constant capital, is the depreciation measure, where you include not only using up raw materials, but also depreciation of the fixed capital, right? So my presumption would be that would be the more appropriate measure than the fixed asset measure.
So I'm not sure I will agree that Marx define constant capital as a flow concept because it seems ambiguous. Most of the time he abstract from fixed capital when he's talking about constant capital.
That's right.
So at this place, I would just, remain open to this. I believe there's a little bit debate over this.
Yeah.
Whether constant capital should, this label should mean fixed capital or just the flow.
Yeah. By the way, Robert, I see your chat question. I agree with you. You should use the fixed capital for measuring the rate of profit, but I'm talking about the measurement of the organic composition of capital. Junshi, we can pursue this later. It's an interesting theoretical question. Thank you. Okay, sorry. Back to you, Gu.
Okay, thank you. And maybe the second question you asked is about the technical choices, which Sheikh talks about this a lot. And here, first, I want to say that our research is implemented on a macro level, not a micro level. So I think here we don't have any good method to test the technical choices directly on a macro level. So so here we just focused on the possibility of increasing organic composition of capital can cause on profit rate, and we to some extent we choose to left this choice of technique questions aside for a while, and maybe in the future research we may find some other ways to test this big problem.
Could it be true that Sheikh's alternative hypothesis yields macro implications other than on the connection between C over V and the profit rate? If it did, then your method would allow you to pursue that.
Okay.
So may
Potentially.
may I add here? May I add something?
Yeah. Please.
So in response to the implication of Sheikh's criterion, so I don't have a definite answer, but my intuition is, since the two criteria actually overlap with each other very much, right?
Mm-hmm.
One is about profit over capital stock. The other
Yep.
is about profit over cost, I guess. So they are actually highly overlapped, and so my recent research indicates that Okishio's criteria actually imply Sheikh's criterion if we are talking about a capital using labor saving profitable technical change. So so I would say empirically it is highly possible that the results are not much different.
Yeah.
But theoretically, Sheikh's criterion might imply a falling rate of profit, since its criterion only concerns the unit cost.
Mm-hmm.
If the technical change involves a big increase in the capital stock, which also reduces the capital cost, it might lead to a falling rate of profit because your capital stock is so huge now, right?
Uh-huh.
So yeah, it might have theoretical implications, but the empirical one, I was saying it's minimal.
I see.
Yes, in response to the reverse of the Okishio theorem that you asked, it actually holds. The reverse actually holds if the technical change only happens in one industry. So that's proof by Bater in a 1989 paper, which is not noticed in the literature, but it is proof when there's only one sector undergoing the technical change.
Huh.
And we are dealing with a macro model. We only have one sector, right? Which means if you are seeing a rising rate of profit, I would say the implication is that the pervasive type of technical change will be cost reducing, will be profitable. But I mean, if we consider a multi-sectoral model, I think the reverse does not hold, since there might be some industries that undergo cost increasing technical change. But if their importance is very little, you will still see a rising rate of profit at the macro level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good, thank you. Gu, is there anything else you want to add?
No, I think I have answered all the questions I remembered.
Okay, very good. Good. So now I was the next presenter, so I will respond to both Junxiang's excellent comments, as well as a question from the floor, which is very apt, that I wanted to speak to in any case, about the additional variable of labor intensity. So first, in response to Junxiang's comments, thank you for these. Let me go to your very last one about how is it that L could change absent actual technical change, a change in technique. Answer, would you agree with me that the amount of labor hours required in order to achieve a certain output, other things equal, is based on assumption of the productivity of labor power, of a given productivity? That is, less productive workers would have to provide more hours.
No, I wouldn't agree that, because the small L is effective labor, right? So what I see a production technique is, say, if you want to produce this pencil, you need so much material and so much, say, attention from the labor power, right? And no matter how your wage changes, this attention, this requirement will not change.
Oh yeah, hold the question of the wage change for a second. I'm just asking a simpler question. Isn't it true that how many labor hours you need in order to get a certain output depends on the underlying productivity of labor power?
But I mean, if you define labor productivity as output divided by the number of hours worked, rather than numbers of effective hours, then I wouldn't agree that.
Well, notice how I'm defecting effective labor hours. So there's only one hours people combination that generates L, right? That's when it's when alpha n equals h. At every other value, you need a higher level than L of hours per unit of output, right? Because labor and hours per worker and number of workers is imperfect substitutes. So unless you use the ideal combination, the mix of hours per workers and numbers of workers, you need more than L hours per unit of actual labor. So that's just a fact about the existing technique. But you're asking me a question about why would the technique change over time? And I'm saying, suppose you've got the optimal mix of hours per worker and number of workers, all right? So you're matching them in exactly the kind way, and that requires L hours to produce. But now suppose you degrade the productivity of workers. Let's suppose, for instance, workers are always tired and malnourished, right? They'll need, even under optimal production conditions, they'll need to work more hours to achieve a certain output. Why? Because they're malnourished or because they're tired. They'll make more mistakes. So to get a certain number of output, you need more labor hours. So what I'm talking about is a dynamic effect of degrading the ability, I mean, the effectiveness of given units of labor power, because they're not getting their subsistence needs met over time. Now, by the way, I grant you, this is not analyzed in the paper. I do not do a dynamic analysis and do not set up a story. But that's the idea I have in mind, that you actually degrade the ability of workers to provide effective labor hours, even if you use labor hours in ideal combination with number of workers. That's the idea that I obviously need to make a lot clearer in the paper. I also, by the way, I totally take your point that this could well just be thought of as just an extension of the standard model, with one significant difference. One implication of the theoretical results is that any quasi-fixed cost that varies with number of workers rather than hours creates this effect where capitalists want to use maximal hours. So that strikes me as a more dramatic challenge to the standard model, right? Because it's not just a question of, oh, do we pay workers by daily wages or by hourly wages, right? If there's any quasi-fixed cost, you're going to get this maximal hours effect. And therefore, you're going to get declining returns to scale, or sorry, increasing returns to scale. Now, you can call that just an extension of the existing model, but it strikes me as a somewhat stronger result. But I take your point as very well taken there. Finally, on let me dial up the question from Akiko. Thank you for this. Akiko raises the question, I assume everybody can see it, about possible trade-offs between intensity of work and hours per worker. And I'm very glad you brought this up, because of course that is a unappreciated variable in Marx's theory of labor versus labor power. That is, intensity of work is an important dimension. To address that additional dimension of intensity of work, I would have to talk about not simply hours as the use value of labor power, but instead a frontier of hours and intensity, where, as you point out, presumably there would be a trade-off at the frontier between sustainable intensity and sustainable hours. That is absolutely true. But the nature of my argument would still cross-apply to that more complicated model. That is, under the stated conditions, capitalists would push workers to the hours intensity frontier, right? So all of the points I make about the disemployment effect, about the increasing returns to scale due to quasi-fixed costs, all of those points would go through, even if you added this important additional dimension of intensity. Thank you for that question. Finally, let me turn it over to Sue and ask if you have any final responses to questions that were raised.
Are there any questions?
Did we get through all the ones that were listed? Let's see.
Yeah, I think that's all.
Okay, so you
That's all.
answered Robert McKee's second contribution at 11 a.m. Do you see that?
Yeah, I see the question. The second question is using the macro level data is correct, but can we get the data? Is this question is about my paper?
Where are we? It's what this tells me is that in value terms, China is exploited by the US, even though it runs a large trade surplus with the US. The trade balance is not relevant to imperialist exploitation, right? Right. So he's distinguishing apparently between, he's asking what distinction is there between a trade surplus and a labor transfer deficit, basically.
Then do you understand the question? You can answer it for me.
Okay.
So yeah, let me just respond to
Oh.
the question by Robert. So we know that China is running a huge trade surplus. And from our analysis, China is transferring a lot of labor out from China. I mean, destination cannot be identified, but we just compare the magnitude before China is transferring out and US transferring in. I mean, it seems to be a paradox here, right? China is working so, accumulating so much trade surplus, but it's being exploited. So this has to do with the accumulated reserves. These labor, these hours that China is working is actually kind of saved in the foreign currency reserves. As you can see from the graph, it's skyrocketing. That is safe. That gives the liquidity of China to go into the world market. But I mean, this is the beauty of the dollar hegemony. If you do not redeem your reserves, if you keep a high reserves, currency reserves, it means that the US does not need to pay back that labor, and it is kind of free. I think this is a very well-known in the theory of money, where you print money, and if people use your money for circulation, and you do not have to pay back for that. There's a term for that, I don't remember. So I think, yeah, I mean, the imperial exploitation could be, could be different from how much trade surplus you have accumulated. Yeah.
Right. Good. All right. So unless there are further questions from the audience, I think with a little bit of time to spare, we are finished. I would like to thank our audience for joining us and for your questions. And I would like to give my thanks to my colleagues who presented and who also discussed. Thank you much for excellent presentations and papers that I'll want to follow up with, I hope later, and see further development in them even when they're published.
I'm sorry, I think there's another question that has not been answered.
Oh, okay. Thank you for catching that.
Yeah, by Mike. So let me answer this question, by the way. So Mike asked the question whether China is turning away from globalization, and how does this fall in the logic of the typical development where a country becomes stronger, it's going to promote free trade. I think China is not turning away from globalization. That's why they frame it as a dual circulation. Right. It is turning away from the reliance of the demand by the Western advanced countries, because that reliance gives a huge leverage for the US to take on China. As our analysis have shown, if say Trump actually did the decoupling, China is going to see 11 million job loss, which is very huge. And China does want to maintain a free access to the world market, but it's going to focus more on the developing countries through the Belt and Road Initiative. I think which would imply that in the future, China would have more trade with the developing world rather than with the developed world, because it does not see much advantage to continue this kind of trade pattern with the developed world. On the one hand, this is a low quality kind of development. You produce very cheap Chinese products, as people complain, and China is not getting a lot of value added from this processing trade. And on the other hand, the purpose to introduce advanced technology by trading with the West and introducing FDI has reached its ceiling, because as we have seen, China has harnessed most of the manufacturing technologies, but not the most advanced one. And to get the most advanced one, the trade would not do the trick anymore, because the Western country does not want to sell you those advanced technologies. So at the same time, they also have this surge in R&D domestically. They have put a lot of money into research, and they take a different route than before to develop those most advanced technologies. So I think there isn't a reason for China to continue this trade pattern with the Western world. But regarding the developing world, China does rely on a lot of resources from Africa and other countries, which I think is very crucial. As we can see from the input-output table, 64% of its gross output comes from imports, which means China, the Western world, the developing world has a lot of raw materials and inputs that China needs. So I don't think China is going to shut the door in this direction.
Right. Great. Thank you very much. And I'll continue again to say thank you to our panelists and discussant. And thank you, by the way, to Lauren, our AV tech, who is doing double duty. She's monitoring 2 sessions at once and managed to meet all our needs despite that handicap. So thank you all to the participants for joining us in this session, which I now call adjourned. Thank you so much. You all take care. Have a good rest of conference.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.